The story opens under a sky bruised with fading daylight, the last warmth of the sun sinking into the horizon of a dry western town. A widowed mother, her clothes patched with more care than fabric, trudges down the dusty road with her young daughter beside her. The mother's gait is heavy, every step labored with exhaustion. Her boots are worn thin, her hands cracked and reddened from work that never paid enough. She carries the air of someone who has been tested beyond her strength, yet still clings to survival for the sake of the little one at her side. The girl, no older than 7 or 8, tries to walk briskly, though her tiny legs often stumble over the uneven ground. Her braids are messy, her cheeks hollowed slightly from hunger, but her eyes, clear and bright, carry a stubborn spark. She clutches a small cloth doll, its stuffing coming loose, the only remnant of a life before hardship. Swallowed them whole. They have come to town because they have no other choice. Their last scraps of bread had been eaten 2 nights ago, and the mother's hands shake from hunger as much as from fatigue. She has been turned away from farmsteads along the way, each refusal delivered with pitying eyes or cold suspicion. Widows are often seen as burdens, mouths to feed with little to give back, and with a child in tow, her chances shrank even further. Now, as they enter the heart of town, the mother musters her remaining courage. She approaches shopkeepers and townsfolk with quiet pleas. "Work, sir? I can cook, clean, sew. Whatever you need," she says softly, though her voice trembles. She meets polite refusals, stern shakes of heads, and sometimes the sting of people turning away without a word. Each rejection feels like a stone added to the burden already weighing on her shoulders. The little girl watches carefully, sensing the unspoken despair in her mother. Though young, she understands more than she should about what hunger means, about how cold nights without shelter gnaw at the spirit. She tries to be cheerful, to smile at people in hopes they'll be kinder if they see her dimples, but most pass them by. A few toss sympathetic glances, but no one steps forward. The mother kneels by her daughter near the well at the edge of town. She smooths back her child's hair, though her hand shakes. "We'll find something, darling," she whispers, her voice fragile as glass. "We just have to keep faith." But inside, her heart aches with fear. What if they don't? What if this is the end of the road for them? It is in this moment of weariness that the girl notices a man across the square. He is tall, broad-shouldered, with a weathered hat casting a shadow over his face. His clothes speak of hard work, his boots, of long rides. He stands apart, silent, with a presence that commands attention without needing words. The rancher. She doesn't know his story, but even in her innocence, she can sense his distance from the rest. His silence feels heavy, like someone who has carried sorrow for far too long. The mother notices him too, but hesitates. Men like him do not often extend help to strangers, especially women who appear with nothing to offer but their hands. Still, hunger sharpens desperation. With a deep breath, she decides she must try. She takes her daughter's hand, grips it firmly, and begins to walk toward him, though fear clutches at her chest. Thus, the first part of the tale closes with mother and daughter standing before the silent rancher. Dust swirls around their feet. The mother's eyes plead, though her lips are hesitant to form the words. The little girl looks up at the tall stranger, sensing that something important hangs in this moment, something that may change their lives forever. The rancher stood at the edge of the town square, his back resting against a hitching post, one boot crossed over the other. His hat brim shielded most of his face, but even hidden, his silence carried weight. People didn't often approach him. He wasn't unkind, not exactly, but he was known for keeping to himself, for living on the far side of the land where his ranch stretched wide and lonely. Some whispered about tragedy in his past, a wife lost, a child gone, but no one dared speak it to his face. His presence was like the desert wind, steady, strong but not something one touched without care. The mother's steps faltered as she led her daughter toward him. Every instinct in her warned her that this man would not be easily moved. His stance was firm, his arms crossed in a way that made him look as though he had heard every plea before and learned to harden himself against them. Still, something deep in her heart told her this might be the only chance left. When she stopped before him, she swallowed hard. "Sir," she began softly, her voice almost breaking under the weight of her desperation. "I've come looking for work. I can cook, mend, tend animals. I'll do anything. Just, please give us a chance. My little girl—" She stopped there, afraid to sound as though she were begging for charity, though in truth, that's what it was. The rancher did not answer right away. He lifted his head just slightly, eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his hat as they fell on the mother and child. The silence stretched long and heavy, broken only by the sound of the wind carrying dust across the square. To onlookers, it seemed the answer was already written. He would refuse. His reputation for solitude was too strong, and he rarely engaged with strangers, much less took them in. The girl, however, did not see him as others did. To her, his silence wasn't rejection, it was consideration. She tugged gently at her mother's hand, then looked up at the tall figure with wide, unflinching eyes. Her small voice rose, trembling yet clear. "Please don't let Mama go hungry, sir. I can help you. I can fetch water, feed the animals, whatever you need. If you can't take her, take me instead." The words startled her mother, who dropped to her knees and tried to hush her, but it was too late. The innocence of the plea cut through the square like a bell tolling. A hush fell over those nearby who had stopped to watch, their whispers stilled. No one had expected such boldness from a child. The rancher's jaw tightened. Something flickered across his face, too quick for most to catch, but it was there, a moment of recognition, maybe pain, as though her words had reached a place in him he'd long buried. He didn't move, but his eyes softened, just slightly, betraying an inner struggle. The mother, mortified, whispered fiercely to her daughter, "Don't say such things." Tears welled in her eyes, both from shame and the raw truth of their plight. She stood again, facing the rancher with trembling defiance. "Forgive her, sir. She's only a child. I don't mean to trouble you further. We'll find another way." Still, the rancher said nothing. He shifted his weight, uncrossing his arms, his gaze lingering on the girl's thin frame and the mother's weary eyes. The townsfolk held their breath, waiting for him to wave them off as he usually did. But instead, he tipped his hat back, slightly, revealing eyes that seemed older than his years, eyes that had seen too much loss. The encounter did not end with words, not yet. Instead, it ended with a silence that was not rejection this time, but contemplation. For the first time in years, the rancher felt the stirrings of a decision he wasn't prepared for. The mother led her daughter away, thinking she had failed. But the rancher's gaze followed them, his mind unsettled, his heart not as hard as it had been when the day began. The street was almost empty by the time the mother decided they should leave the square. Her shoulders slumped as though every rejection she'd endured had finally broken her down. She held her daughter's hand tighter than ever, hoping to shield her from disappointment, though the child had already seen too much. But the little girl, walking beside her, kept glancing back over her shoulder at the rancher. Something about the way he'd looked at them, silent, yes, but not cruel, stayed with her. Most people looked at them with pity, or worse, annoyance. His eyes, however, had carried something different, something that almost felt like remembering. She could not explain it, but in her young heart, she believed he wasn't as hard as everyone thought. When the mother turned them toward the edge of town, the girl suddenly stopped. She pulled back, her small feet planted firmly in the dust. "Mama, wait," she said. Her voice was urgent, though hushed, as though she'd just made up her mind about something too important to let pass. The mother frowned, tugging gently at her hand. "We mustn't linger, child. We'll find food somehow." Her voice shook, for she had no idea how they would. But the girl shook her head. "No, I need to tell him." Before her mother could stop her, she let go of her hand and darted back, across the square. Dust kicked up around her boots as she ran to the rancher, who still stood by the hitching post, watching from under his hat brim. Her mother's heart lurched, shame, fear, desperation twisting together as she hurried after her, calling her name. The girl stopped in front of the rancher, her chest heaving from the short sprint. She lifted her chin to look up at him. Though she was so small before his towering frame, she refused to let her courage falter. Her little voice, trembling but determined, rose into the silence between them. "Please, sir," she said, her words tumbling out with urgency. "If you can't help Mama, take me instead. I can work. I can fetch water, feed your horses, even cook if you show me how. Don't let her go hungry. I don't need much, but she does." The square grew eerily still. A blacksmith paused at his forge, wiping his brow with a cloth, while two women near the mercantile stopped mid-conversation. Everyone who overheard seemed frozen, stunned by the innocence and selflessness of the child's plea. The rancher's breath caught in his chest. He was not a man easily shaken, but those words struck deep, as though pulling open a scar, he thought, long healed. For a moment he wasn't in the dusty square, but back in his own memory, his own little girl's voice echoing in his mind. The way she'd once offered to help Papa on the ranch in her sweet, proud way. The ache of loss, buried under years of silence, swelled in him again. The mother arrived then, nearly stumbling as she pulled her daughter back. Her face flushed red, tears burning in her eyes. "Forgive her, sir," she pleaded. "She doesn't know what she says. She's only trying to protect me." She knelt beside her daughter, voice breaking. "You must never speak like that again. Do you hear? You are my heart. I would never let you give yourself away." The little girl clung to her mother's sleeve, but her eyes didn't leave the rancher's. Though frightened now, she still believed he had heard her, truly heard her, and that mattered. The rancher remained silent, but his stillness no longer carried dismissal. His weathered face betrayed a storm beneath, grief, resistance, and something softer, something he didn't want to name. He shifted, his hand brushing the brim of his hat as though to hide the emotion flickering in his eyes. He said nothing, but he didn't turn away either. And for the girl, that silence was as good as hope. The square seemed to hold its breath after the child's bold words. The little girl's plea still lingered in the air, fragile but sharp, like the ringing of a church bell after the final toll. All eyes were on the rancher now, waiting for him to respond. Yet he did not move, did not speak. His silence stretched so long that even the wind seemed to hush. Silence was nothing new for him. The rancher was a man who had built his life upon it. Since the day loss carved its deep wound into his heart, words had felt useless, hollow. Talking wouldn't bring back the woman he'd loved or the small daughter whose laughter had once filled his home. So he had learned to live without speech, to let his presence, his work, and his solitude speak for him. The town had come to accept it, even expect it. He was the quiet one, the man whose silence warned people to keep their distance. But this time, silence was different. His stillness wasn't born of indifference. It was a battle. Inside him, two forces collided. His instinct to turn away, to protect himself from feeling again, and the tender ache awakened by the little girl's selflessness. The mother misread it, as most would. She pulled her daughter closer, shame heavy in her posture. "I'm sorry to trouble you, sir," she said quickly, her voice breaking under the weight of rejection she believed was coming. "We'll leave you be." She bowed her head, preparing to walk away before he could dismiss them outright. The crowd watching began to murmur. Some shook their heads, whispering that it was foolish to expect kindness from a man so hardened by life. Others pitied the mother and child, but pity alone had never filled an empty stomach. The rancher's silence, however, was not dismissal this time. His eyes, shadowed beneath the brim of his hat, followed the girl as she clung to her mother's skirts. He saw the smallness of her hands, the dirt on her boots, the faint trembling in her limbs from hunger. More than that, he saw her courage, her willingness to offer herself in place of her mother. It pierced through the armor he'd worn for years. Memories stirred like ghosts. He could almost hear his own little girl's laughter echoing across the ranch yard, the sound of her bare feet pattering against the wooden porch. He remembered her insistence that she could help Papa with the cows, even though she was far too little. And then he remembered the silence that had replaced her voice, the unbearable emptiness of a home with no laughter. His jaw clenched, his heart warring with itself. He told himself he owed these strangers nothing, that taking them in would only open old wounds best left sealed. Yet the child's words had struck a truth he couldn't deny. He couldn't look at her and see nothing. The mother tugged at her daughter's hand, trying to lead her away. For a moment, it looked as though he would let them go. That would have been the easier path, retreating into the safety of solitude, watching them disappear into the distance as so many others had before. But his boots stayed rooted to the ground. He didn't speak, not yet. Words, after all, had never come easily to him. But his silence no longer carried rejection. Instead, it carried weight, possibility, and an unspoken promise that something had shifted. The girl sensed it, too. Even as her mother pulled her away, she glanced back at him. And though he said nothing, his eyes met hers for the briefest moment, steady and unwavering. In that gaze, she felt something her mother could not see yet. Not dismissal, but consideration. The townsfolk dispersed eventually, shaking their heads, but the girl's heart held on to hope. The rancher's silence, though heavy, was not final. It was the silence of a man standing at the edge of a choice he did not know how to make. Though life on the ranch began to settle into a rhythm, shadows lingered beneath the surface. For the mother, every day carried a tug-of-war between gratitude and unease. She had food in her belly now, a roof overhead, and work to keep her hands busy, yet she couldn't silence the nagging voice that told her she didn't belong. Each time the rancher passed by, quiet and steady, she wondered if he regretted his choice, if he saw her as a burden rather than a help. The rancher, too, carried a quiet turmoil. His days were filled with chores that once dragged on endlessly, but now passed quicker with extra hands around. Still, the presence of the mother and child stirred up memories he had long buried. The little girl's laughter would drift across the yard and catch him off guard, dragging him back to another time, when his own daughter had darted barefoot. Through the same fields, braids flying as she shouted for him to chase her. At night, when the new child's giggles echoed in the halls, he sometimes had to retreat to the porch, staring at the stars just to steady himself. The mother noticed his absences. At first, she assumed they were because of her, that her presence unsettled him. She tried harder, working longer hours, pushing herself beyond exhaustion. Her pride demanded she prove herself, but her heart ached with doubt. One evening, when she burned her hands pulling bread from the oven, she bit back tears, not from pain, but from the fear that she was failing him, failing the chance he'd given them. The little girl, however, saw more clearly than either adult. Children often do. She noticed how the rancher's eyes softened whenever her mother entered the room, even if he quickly looked away. She noticed how he lingered at the table longer now, not rushing his meal as he once had. She noticed the way he listened, quietly, when her mother hummed an old lullaby while sewing by the fire. The girl, with her innocent heart, understood something both of them were too guarded to admit. They were each other's healing, though they didn't know it yet. But shadows do not fade easily. One afternoon, while repairing a fence together, the rancher startled when the little girl asked, "Did you ever have a daughter, sir?" His hammer stilled mid-swing, his jaw tightening. He muttered something about getting back to work and turned away. The girl blinked in confusion, sensing she had touched a wound she didn't understand. That night, as the mother tucked her daughter into bed, the child whispered, "He's sad, Mama. Sad like you, but in a different way." The mother smoothed her hair and kissed her forehead, but her thoughts lingered long after the child slept. She realized then that the rancher's silence wasn't emptiness, it was grief. And perhaps, she thought, that was why he had taken them in. Not because he needed help on the ranch, but because deep down he needed something to fill the void. Still, fear gnawed at her. If his grief was too deep, would he one day send them away? Could they survive losing the fragile sense of belonging they had found here? The rancher wrestled with the same fear. He told himself to keep his distance, to treat them as helpers and nothing more. But every time the girl reached for his hand or the mother offered a quiet smile, he felt the cracks widening in the walls he had built. He didn't know if he was ready for what it meant, for the possibility of loving and losing again. Thus, even as the ranch came alive with warmth and laughter, shadows of the past hovered over them all. It was not yet clear whether those shadows would smother the fragile light or be driven away by it. The ranch might have begun to feel like a home again, but the land itself was not merciful. Summer brought a heat that cracked the earth and drained the streams. Grass browned under the relentless sun, and the cattle grew restless, their ribs showing more with each passing week. The rancher had weathered dry seasons before, but never with the weight of 2 extra mouths to feed, mouths he had chosen, and now felt bound to protect. Days stretched long under the scorching sun. The rancher worked from dawn until nightfall, hauling water, checking wells, and moving cattle in search of grazing. The mother insisted on helping despite his protests. She carried buckets until her arms ached, mended fences under the sweltering heat, and cooked with whatever meager supplies they had left. Her pride would not allow her to sit idle while he bore the burden alone. At first, the rancher tried to send her inside, telling her the work was too hard for her, but she stood her ground. "If I eat here, I work here," she said firmly, her chin lifted. Though he scowled at her stubbornness, he respected it, silently admiring her grit. The little girl, too, refused to be left out. She followed them to the pastures, carrying smaller buckets, fetching tools, and chasing stray calves back to the herd. She stumbled often, scraped her knees, and once fell face first into the dust, but she always got back up. "I'm strong, just like Mama," she declared, brushing dirt from her dress. Her determination made the rancher's chest ache with a mix of pride and fear. She reminded him so much of the daughter he had lost. But drought was not their only trial. With land parched and cattle weakened, rustlers saw opportunity. One evening, as the sun dipped low, the rancher spotted signs. Hoof prints where they shouldn't be, a section of fence cut clean. His jaw tightened. Trouble was brewing. That night, while the mother tucked her daughter into bed, the rancher sat at the table, oiling his rifle. His silence was heavier than usual, and when the mother asked what was wrong, he answered curtly, "Men looking for what ain't theirs." Her stomach twisted at his words, fear flickering in her eyes. She knew too well the cruelty of desperate men. The next day confirmed it. 3 rustlers rode near the far pasture, bold and grinning, thinking the rancher too outnumbered to stop them. But they hadn't expected the stubbornness of the little family they meant to rob. The rancher confronted them, rifle steady, his stance unyielding. The mother stood at his side, not with a weapon, but with a fire in her eyes that told the men this was no easy prey. The little girl, hidden behind the fence, watched with wide eyes. She wanted to run to them, to stand with them, but her mother's earlier warning echoed in her ears. Stay back, no matter what happens. And yet, when one of the rustlers tried to circle toward the barn where calves were penned, she couldn't hold still. Heart-pounding, she darted out, waving her arms and shouting, "Get away!" The man laughed at her, but his distraction gave the rancher just enough time to fire a warning shot, the bullet striking dirt near the man's boots. The sound cracked. Through the air, and the rustlers, realizing the rancher's resolve, cursed and retreated. When silence returned, the rancher turned on the girl, his voice sharp. "You could have been killed!" She flinched, tears brimming, but before he could say more, the mother stepped in, placing a steady hand on his arm. "She was brave," she said softly. "Too brave, perhaps, but she did it for the calves. And for us." The rancher's anger melted into something heavier, fear, love, and the painful memory of another child he couldn't protect. He turned away, his shoulders tense, while the little girl slipped her small hand into his. "I'm sorry," she whispered. His chest tightened, but he did not pull away. That night, as they sat by the fire, the drought still looming and danger not yet gone, there was an unspoken truth between them. Survival was no longer the burden of one man alone. They were in it together, bound not just by circumstance, but by choice, courage, and a fragile love growing stronger with every trial. The mother led her daughter away from the square, her grip tight, her heart pounding with shame and desperation. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though she carried not only her own weariness but the crushing weight of failure. She had begged, and in her mind, she had been met with rejection. Pride was a fragile thing, already worn thin by hunger and hardship, and in that moment, it seemed to collapse entirely. She tried to soothe her daughter, whispering words that sounded hopeful but rang hollow. "It's all right, darling. We'll find another way. Mama will manage." Inside, however, despair clawed at her. She wondered how much longer she could keep walking, keep fighting, with nothing left to give. Behind them, the rancher remained where he stood, motionless. His silence stretched, but it no longer felt like distance. It felt like a gathering storm. His eyes followed the mother's stooped shoulders and the little girl's brave attempt to keep her chin lifted. Something in him twisted, deep and sharp. He remembered the last time he had watched someone walk away without him stopping them. His wife, in the fever that had taken her, and later the small pine box that carried his daughter to the earth. He had stood still then, too, powerless, silent. And afterward, he had promised himself never to open his heart again, never to invite loss to sit at his table. But as he watched this child, thin, hungry, yet brave enough to offer herself in her mother's place, he realized that silence would cost him more this time. Turning away now would not be protection. It would be cowardice. The townsfolk had already resumed their business, dismissing the scene as finished. Yet inside the rancher the decision was forming, slow but unstoppable. His pride, that old armor, built of grief and stubbornness, cracked under the weight of the little girl's words. With a deep breath, he pushed himself forward. His boots struck the dusty ground with deliberate steps as he crossed the square. The mother, hearing his approach, froze. She turned, startled, clutching her daughter close, as if expecting him to scold them for daring to trouble him further. Instead, he stopped before them. For a moment, he said nothing, his hat brim shadowing his face. Then he crouched down, lowering himself to the little girl's eye level. His weathered hands rested on his knees, steady, but not unkind. He looked at her long and hard, studying, the resolve in her young eyes. "You were willing to give yourself up for your mama," he said at last, his voice low and gravelly, as though unused to speaking. "That's not something I can ignore." The mother blinked in shock. It was the first time she had heard his voice, and it carried both weight and weariness. "Sir," she began, but he held up a hand, silencing her gently. His gaze shifted to her. There was no pity in his eyes, only a kind of reluctant recognition. "You're proud. You don't want charity, but pride won't feed your little one." He paused, then said the words neither of them expected. "I'll take you both." The air seemed to stop. The mother's breath caught in her throat. She shook her head instinctively, disbelief flooding her. "Both? Sir, I couldn't possibly—" "You can," he interrupted firmly, though not unkindly. "You asked for work. Work I have. More than I can handle alone. If you're willing, then come." The little girl's eyes widened, her hand clutching her mother's tightly. Her heart leapt with hope, though her mother still hesitated, pride warring with gratitude. To accept would mean surrendering the last shreds of dignity she had clung to, admitting she could not do it alone. Yet looking into her daughter's hopeful face, she knew her pride was not worth the child's hunger. Tears welled in her eyes as she nodded slowly. "We'll come," she whispered, her voice breaking. And so, with a single decision, the rancher changed the course of 3 lives. What had begun as silence ended in an invitation, not just into his home, but into the guarded space of his heart. The journey to the ranch was long, a quiet ride through open fields where the land stretched wide beneath an endless sky. The mother rode in the wagon with her daughter beside her, clutching the worn doll in her hands. She kept sneaking glances at the rancher, who guided the reins with steady hands, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. He said little, only offering short, practical instructions. "Hold on tight," or "We'll be there by sundown." The mother's heart churned with unease. Gratitude, yes, but also fear. She had entrusted herself and her daughter to a man she barely knew. Though he had shown a spark of kindness in town, his silence still unsettled her. She wondered what life in his home would demand, and whether she could ever truly repay what felt like a debt she had no means to cover. When the ranch finally came into view, it rose against the horizon with a quiet strength. Wide pastures stretched in every direction, dotted with cattle. The barn stood tall and weathered, its red paint faded by sun and wind. The house itself was sturdy, its porch wrapped around like open arms, though it looked lonely, the windows dark, as though waiting for light and laughter to return. The little girl's eyes lit up instantly. To her, it was a palace compared to the empty roads they had traveled. She pressed her small face to the side of the wagon, drinking in every detail. "Mama, look, horses!" she squealed, pointing to a pair grazing near the fence. Her joy carried across the yard, and for the briefest moment, the rancher's lips twitched as though he might almost smile. The first days were difficult. The mother insisted on working immediately, determined not to feel like a burden. She rose, before dawn, helping in the kitchen, learning the rhythm of the ranch. She scrubbed, cooked, and mended until her hands were raw, each task a way to prove her worth. Pride still whispered to her that she must justify her place here. The rancher, however, didn't demand explanations. He gave her space, showing her how to grind feed, gather eggs, and tend to the garden. He rarely spoke more than necessary, but his guidance was steady, never harsh. He noticed her efforts, though he said little of it. The little girl, meanwhile, adapted quickly. Children have a way of finding wonder in new places, and she threw herself into ranch life with unshakable energy. She chased chickens until her laughter echoed across the yard, tried to mimic the rancher's firm way of speaking when she called the cows, and followed him like a shadow whenever he let her. Where her mother saw only the man's stern exterior, the girl sensed the quiet patience underneath. She treated him not as a figure to fear, but as someone steady, someone safe. It was the girl who softened the days. At supper, when the table would otherwise be silent, she filled the air with chatter, stories of how she'd fed the chickens or named every horse she saw. The rancher listened, his head bowed over his plate, but his ears tuned to her every word. Sometimes, when she made a joke too clever for her age, a quiet chuckle escaped him, startling both her and her mother. The mother watched all this with mixed emotions. She saw her daughter's joy, her quick bond with the rancher, and part of her heart swelled with relief. Yet another part ached with caution. Could they really belong here? Or was this kindness only temporary, destined to vanish like so many hopes before? Still, as days turned into weeks, a rhythm emerged. The ranch, once silent and empty, began to stir with life again. The porch heard the sound of a child's laughter, the kitchen smelled of warm bread, and in the evenings, the firelight glowed brighter than it had in years. The mother began to realize something unexpected. This wasn't just about survival anymore. A seed of belonging had been planted. And though the rancher remained guarded, his silence was no longer a wall. It was a space slowly filling with the sound of family. The rustlers never returned, but the danger they brought had left a mark. For nights afterward, the rancher sat on the porch with his rifle across his knees, watching the horizon long after the stars came out. The mother, sewing by the fire, noticed the way his eyes carried a weight heavier than any threat of cattle thieves. She recognized that look. She had seen it in her own reflection. It was the look of someone haunted by the past. It was the little girl who bridged the silence between them. One evening, after finishing her chores of gathering eggs and brushing the horses, she padded out to the porch in her bare feet. Without hesitation, she climbed onto the rancher's knee as though she had every right to be there. He stiffened. At first, unaccustomed to such closeness, but she leaned against his chest and said, "You're safe now. We're here." The words struck him like a hammer against stone. For years he had carried the belief that he was alone, that no one could reach into the hollow left by his wife and daughter. Yet this child spoke as though she had already claimed that empty space. He didn't answer, but his arm, almost against his will, wrapped around her small frame. Inside, the mother watched through the window. Her heart trembled with gratitude and fear. She had not expected her daughter to bond so easily with the man, nor the man to allow it. Part of her longed to believe it meant they could stay, truly stay. Another part warned her not to hope too much. Hope had betrayed her before. Days passed, and small shifts began to take place. The rancher, once a figure of silence, started to linger in conversation even if his words were few. At the table, when the girl chattered about her adventures, he asked a question now and then. "Did the mare behave today? Or did you count all the hens?" Simple words, but to the girl they meant everything. To the mother, they were proof of walls slowly crumbling. One night, as the wind howled outside, the fire burned low in the hearth. The mother sat mending a shirt while the girl dozed on a blanket nearby. The rancher, unusually restless, paced the room before finally stopping, his voice breaking the silence. "I lost them," he said abruptly. The mother looked up, startled. His hands were clenched at his sides, his face shadowed by grief. "My wife, my little girl. Fever took 'em both. I buried 'em right here on this land. After that, there wasn't much left worth saying." The mother set her sewing aside, her heart aching at the rawness of his confession. For so long she had wondered what lay behind his silence, and now the truth was laid bare. She swallowed, then spoke softly. "I lost, too. My husband. He left me with debts I couldn't pay. Then sickness took what little family I had left. I've been running ever since. I thought if I kept moving, maybe it would hurt less. But it never does." Their eyes met across the firelight, two souls scarred by loss recognizing each other. In that moment, the distance between them shrank. not with grand gestures, but with the quiet honesty of shared pain. The little girl stirred, blinking sleepily, and crawled over to them. She slipped her small hand into the rancher's calloused palm, then into her mother's. "Then don't be sad anymore," she whispered. "We can be a family now." The rancher's throat tightened, and for the first time in years, tears stung his eyes. He didn't speak, but he didn't need to. The warmth of her hand, the softness of the mother's gaze, said what words never could. They were no longer alone. From that night forward, something shifted. The past still lingered, but it no longer defined them. Around the table in the fields, by the fire, the sense of belonging grew, fragile but real. Healing had begun, not through forgetting, but through the simple, powerful act of choosing each other. The seasons turned, and with them, life on the ranch slowly transformed. The drought eased as autumn rains returned, soaking the parched earth, until the fields breathed green again. The cattle grew strong, the wells filled, and the ranch, once a place of silence and sorrow, echoed with laughter and warmth. The rancher noticed the change most in the mornings. Where once he had risen to an empty house and eaten his breakfast alone, now he woke to the soft sounds of the mother humming in the kitchen and the little girl's chatter as she scampered about, full of boundless energy. He would sit at the table, sipping his coffee, while the child proudly announced her plans for the day, plans that often involved shadowing him in the fields or learning to ride the gentlest horse. At first, he resisted the intrusion of their voices into his quiet world. But in time, he realized he no longer longed for silence. Instead, he found himself looking forward to it, needing it in a way that startled him. He wasn't just enduring their presence, he was cherishing it. The mother, too, found herself changing. For years, she had carried the instinct of a survivor, always braced for the moment when kindness would be withdrawn, when the world would turn cruel again. But here, with every passing day, the rancher's actions wore down her fears. He never spoke much, but his steadiness told her everything. The extra portion of food he served her when she was too tired to cook, the way he walked the fence line, twice over when she worried about rustlers, the quiet respect he showed her work. He treated her not as a burden, nor as charity, but as someone who belonged. And then there was the little girl, sunshine in human form, whose laughter rang across the ranch like a bell. She had stopped asking if they were going to leave. She no longer clutched her mother's skirts at every noise or watched the road with anxious eyes. Instead, she spoke of our ranch and our home, her certainty a balm that healed wounds deeper than she understood. One evening, as the harvest moon rose over the fields, the three of them sat together on the porch. The little girl curled up on the rancher's lap, her eyes heavy with sleep, while the mother stitched a tear in his shirt by lantern light. The silence was comfortable now, not heavy as before. The rancher cleared his throat, his voice low but firm. "You know, you don't have to leave, not ever. This place, it's yours as much as mine now." The mother's hands stilled, the needle trembling between her fingers. She looked up, her eyes searching his. "Are you sure?" she whispered. "We've brought you nothing but trouble, and life," he interrupted gently. His weathered face softened. "This house was nothing but shadows before you, or you brought it back to life." Her eyes filled with tears, but this time they weren't born of fear. She nodded, unable to speak, and he gave a small, rare smile. The little girl stirred and mumbled sleepily. "So, we're a family now." The rancher pressed a hand over hers. "Yes, little one, we're a family." In that moment, under the wide sweep of stars, the past no longer ruled them. Loss and grief had shaped who they were, but love and belonging had given them a new beginning. The ranch was no longer just land. It was home. And within its fences, a mother, her daughter, and a rancher found what they each thought was lost forever: hope, love, and family.